Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Devotional Criticism. My name is Ian Garcia, and it's currently a lovely spring day in New York City where I decided to just stop by Central Park for a minute or two, where it's incredibly crowded because it's 420, before proceeding on my way to the historic Paris Theater for a screening of Our Father the Devil. Our Father the Devil is a debut feature film from Cameroonian-American writer-director Ellie Foumbi. This movie had its premiere at the Venice Film Festival all the way back in September of 2021. Since then, it's been making the festival rounds, generating a decent amount of buzz, and was acquired in March by the distributor Synopsis, who are apparently planning a proper limited release of it later this year before it goes exclusively to streaming service Fandor. This movie has been having a really quite interesting trajectory over the last year or so because it hasn't yet had an official release of any kind, but it still ended up being nominated for Best Feature at this year's 38th Independent Spirit Awards, where it was clearly a rather surprising dark horse inclusion alongside, like, Women Talking, Bones and All, Tar, and of course Everything Everywhere All at Once. So when I saw that it was coming to the Paris Theater, I obviously had to jump at the chance to see what all the hubbub was about, and plus it's giving me an opportunity to finally check out the Paris Theater itself, which is a place that I've always wanted to check out but never really did. You know how it is, there's like 15 great repertory and specialty theaters in this city, and while the Paris Theater still does some pretty good repertory programming itself, since its acquisition by Netflix, it really has more or less turned into a sort of walk-in outpost for their own catalog of streaming content. In fact, the Netflix connection probably isn't a coincidence, because on February 24th of 2021, Netflix did in fact release on its Behind the Streams YouTube channel a short film by Foumbi called Home, as part of its partnership with Film Independent to finance short films by Black filmmakers. Obviously, Netflix isn't the one who ended up acquiring the streaming rights to Our Father the Devil, but I think it says something that for a film that is still currently a festival darling, something where the actual distributor itself still hasn't specified a release date, I think it's probably more likely than not that there might be an ongoing working relationship that's being boosted here. Not coincidentally, also that short film, Home, also featured West African actor Souleymane Sy Savané, who also stars alongside Babatita Sajo in Our Father the Devil. I must say, as far as Home is concerned, it's not a very good short film, but that hasn't really dissuaded my anticipation going into Our Father the Devil, firstly because of Sy Savané, who is a tremendous actor. Going a little while back, but I highly recommend people check out Ramin Bahrani's Goodbye Solo for Sy Savané's central performance alone. He's really tremendous in that. Secondly, at the end of the day, while I certainly haven't seen enough of Foumbi's short work up to this point, seeing one of her earlier short films, Last Day in Paradise, that was enough to confirm for me that there is really an incredible talent here, not just on a technical side of things, but especially in terms of her great facility with actors, and on the writing side, her ability to weave very subtle, poetic narratives that compress a lot in a very short amount of time, say a lot with very little. Foumbi is a really interesting case because her credits up to this point have really been primarily as an actor rather than a writer-director. In fact, here she is in one of her earliest roles as an ex-girlfriend in the very low-budget, very polemical kind of DIY movie called Pro Black Sheep, which the director just has up on YouTube. Anybody can watch it. It's kind of cool seeing someone whose movie went up against pretty good competition at the Independent Spirit Awards this year in something from 2009 that's so low budget and just like up on YouTube in 480p. But she's also very recently had a top billed role in an independent film called Paris is in Harlem, which is itself still pretty much doing the festival rounds and hasn't yet been acquired by a distributor for an official release. Hopefully it goes somewhere this year and we'll be able to get a feature-worthy glance at both the acting and directing sides of Ellie Foumbi, with the added bonus that Sy Savané also appears in Paris is in Harlem. At any rate, I should probably be getting to the Paris pretty soon, as it's almost showtime, and I'll let you know what I think on the other side. Cheers. All right, I'm back from the screening and back on my home turf here. So it turns out that this screening was a rather typical situation of me just sort of seeing what movies were playing and going to the one I was most interested in, and not realizing until I got there that, oh, this is part of a whole special thing. For reference, I really don't make decisions about what I see in theaters from week to week based just on movies I want to see. I really do go straight to the source. I check with the theaters themselves about their weekly programming because there are all kinds of situations where stuff just doesn't get publicized through mainstream channels, where you'd have no idea about them unless you were proactive about consulting theater programs rather than just, say, a wiki of a new releases list. And as a side note, I really want to encourage people, especially people who love movies and who are really concerned about the sort of decline in the art form, or at least the ability for independent filmmakers to produce original stuff. I really want to encourage them to consider seeing being a film lover as not just being about watching movies. When push comes to shove, supporting filmmaking for the vast majority of us as consumers comes down to not really so much supporting movies, but supporting theaters and supporting festivals and supporting the kind of programming that keeps film alive, not just as a market, but as a specific artistic culture and as a public good. If I hadn't gone to the Paris Theater website at the beginning of the week, I would have had no idea that Our Father the Devil was playing anywhere, and if I hadn't decided to go see Our Father the Devil, I would have had no idea that this was actually a part of a week-long event at the Paris Theater. Basically, what I stumbled into was the opening night of a program commemorating the Biennale College Cinema, which is basically a kind of internship and grant program of the Venice Biennale. Most film lovers will be recognizing the Venice Biennale as the organizer of the Venice International Film Festival, but the Biennale really is a very prestigious and multidisciplinary institution. They've been around since the 19th century, and they do all kinds of contemporary art exhibitions, archival and research work, and in this case, programs to specially commission independent films. So, more or less, for the next week, the Paris Theater is going to be hosting exclusive screenings of films that were commissioned and funded by the Biennale College program. It was really a kind of event. There were representatives from Netflix there, Jeffrey Sharp, the executive director of the Gotham Film and Media Institute, which is a partner of the Biennale College. He was there. Savina Niroti, the head of the Biennale's programming, she gave some introductory remarks. There were journalists there, etc. And this is the really surreal thing, because I'm used to being at screenings where all the best seats are reserved for media types and principal members of the production team and the crew. And I was kind of having a difficult time navigating the theater seating. So even though I sort of suspected I wasn't in the right place, I sort of just went into the reserved seating and just sat down in like literally the best seat in the house, right in the middle, exactly the right proximity from the screen. I even asked this woman next to me if I was in the right place, and she told me, no, it's fine, nobody's sitting there. And literally just one row ahead of me and a couple of seats to the left of me is Tinks Chan, the cinematographer of the movie I'm about to watch. Ellie Foumbi was there, also, for an obligatory Q&A afterwards, which included some behind-the-scenes stills and video. But the real treat of that was that the person conducting the Q&A was Nikyato Jusu, the writer and director of Nanny, which was definitely among my favorite films of last year. Jusu and Foumbi are apparently not only colleagues, but quite close friends, and in fact, Foumbi has acted for Jusu before, most recently in Jusu's 2019 short vampire film Suicide by Sunlight, but also, all the way back in their college days, Foumbi was in Say Grace Before Drowning, which was Jusu's, I believe it was her graduate film from NYU. As far as Our Father the Devil, though, it's time to get into the plot synopsis, because I gotta do that right away, or else I always end up just sort of rambling on an awful lot about a movie before I remember I haven't even really given a context for anything that I'm talking about. And just a heads up, I'm going to try to not be too spoilery with this one, but at the end of the day, while I totally support going into movies blind, there really are two major developments in the plot of the film that actually come relatively early in its runtime. So in order to talk about the movie in any substantive way, I have to at least spoil one of them. And even if I don't spoil the second development, the second twist, as it were, this is just one of those things where I have a strong feeling if you know the first twist, you could probably just do some movie logic in your head and figure out where the narrative is going. Not that there's no surprises in Our Father the Devil, just that they should probably be reserved as surprises for people who haven't seen the movie yet. But if you don't want to be spoiled, you can just check the time codes below and skip the synopsis, or better yet, you can see the movie yourself first before you get my take on it. And happy day, it turns out that Our Father the Devil is going to be playing at the Atlanta Film Festival, but you don't have to go all the way to Atlanta to see it. In fact, the Atlanta Film Festival and the folks behind Our Father the Devil have done something that is becoming increasingly common in these post-COVID days, but is no less appreciated by those of us who really can't afford to go to many film festivals. They are opening the screening of Our Father the Devil to the public by hosting a stream of it on the website Eventive. You can pre-order your tickets for the Eventive stream now. You can also make a donation to support the Atlanta Film Festival when you make your purchase. And after 6:15 p.m. Eastern Time on April 27th, you'll have a full 8 days to watch Our Father the Devil before anybody else at your leisure from the comfort of your laptop or on an Eventive TV app. With that, let's get into what this movie is all about. So, our story takes place in Luchon, a commune in the mountainous regions of southwestern France. Luchon is known for its beautiful landscapes, its idyllic climate, and therefore its notoriety as a resort and a spa town. Our primary setting is an assisted living facility for the elderly, where Marie, our heroine, played by Babetida Sajo, is the head chef. Marie is a Guinean woman, which is to say she emigrated to France from the Republic of Guinea. More specifically, she seems to be Mandinka or Malinke alternately, which is a West African ethno-linguistic group. She speaks French fluently, but also occasionally uses Mandinka. Despite her relatively young age, as we get to know her, we get the impression that Marie has had a rather hard, lonely life. She has friends, principally Nadia, played by Jennifer Chiakpi, who is a nurse at the facility, who is always trying to draw her out of her shell and meet people and to date. She certainly has a very obvious potential love interest in the form of Arnaud, played by Franck Sorel, a very handsome, strong, but sensitive bartender who's always flirting with Marie and clearly has it rather down bad for her specifically. Marie is very career-focused, though, and very withdrawn. She sometimes humors Franck, but doesn't so much refuse his romantic advances as she is constantly avoiding the possibility of reciprocation. Her closest relationship seems to be with Jeanne, a patient at the facility played by Martine Amis. It turns out that Jeanne was, in fact, Marie's culinary teacher. It's implied that she was influential in getting her the job as the head chef, and their relationship is even so close that Jeanne gifts to Marie ownership of a small, isolated cabin that has been in her family for generations, of course, over the protests of her greedy and spoiled grandchildren. But there are, of course, allusions to much darker sides of things. Marie has scars all over her body. There are allusions to the fact that she might be suffering from some kind of anxiety disorder or post-traumatic stress, all of which comes to a head when a very mysterious Catholic priest, Father Patrick, played by Suleiman C. Savane, begins coming to the facility to minister to the old folks there. Marie is initially not at all interested in meeting Father Patrick, but the scene in which he's introduced is very hypnotic. Marie seems drawn just to the sound of his voice, and when she finally sees him in the flesh, she completely passes out from horror. Marie basically becomes obsessed by the idea that this Father Patrick is not who he appears to be, but is rather a West African warlord by the name of Sogo, who allegedly died many years ago. Things escalate pretty quickly from there. One night, she's working late, closing the kitchen, and Father Patrick comes down asking her for some food. Marie basically has a nervous break as Father Patrick keeps talking to her and getting uncomfortably close to her, despite the fact that they don't know each other, supposedly. She suddenly whips around, knocks him out with a frying pan, and then takes his unconscious body, puts it in the back of her car, and drives it all the way up to the mountainside to the cabin that Jeanne gave her, where she then ties him up by the hands and holds him prisoner. That's the first shoe that drops, the first twist, so to speak, of Our Father the Devil. It takes a really stark turn from what came before, and it's really anyone's guess where things are going. Obviously, there is another shoe that needs to drop really soon, whether or not Father Patrick really is Sogo. We actually learn the answer to that question much sooner than you might expect, but more or less Marie intends to keep the man who she, no matter what, is convinced is the dreaded Sogo there, and to interrogate him, torture him, and ultimately kill him, in revenge for Sogo leading a massacre of her village, which led to the murder of her entire family when she was just 12 years old, and subsequently indoctrinating her as a child soldier in his militia, and also routinely raping her as a child. That's the bare bones of the plot, though, and again, without giving away too much, what transpires is really a much more tonally complicated narrative, one in which this chamber drama that gradually unfolds between Marie and Father Patrick is juxtaposed with the ironic sense of the ongoing normality and emotional atomization of the world around her, where no one really ever suspects not just the extent of what Marie is doing, but more so what she's going through internally. This incredibly violent tragedy that is playing out just under their noses and behind the walls of her eyes and of her body language. But that's probably enough for a synopsis. Let's get into the review proper. All right, welcome back to anybody who skipped the synopsis. Again, I'm going to try to be a good boy about this and not spoil anything. So let me just start out by saying that having seen Our Father the Devil in the very specific environment that I did, there was definitely a very distinct feeling that seemed to bubble up in pockets of the audience that, despite the very serious subject matter that the film was exploring, the tone of the film was actually surprisingly complex in a lot of ways. The thing that is very interesting about the movie, for me at least, is that it is one of the first feature fiction films that I've seen to deal with the subject of violence in post-colonial Africa, specifically the use of child soldiers, in which the predominant focus was not on the violence itself, but upon its aftermath. With movies like Jean-Stéphane Sauveur's Johnny Mad Dog or Kari Joji Fukunaga's Beasts of No Nation, it's very hard to disaggregate the sense of a fictionalized feature-length film drama that is apparently so intensively interested in truthfully and accurately portraying the phenomenon of child soldier militias and what it apparently speaks to about the broader socio-political problems that are almost always framed as endemic to countries on the African continent. It's hard to disaggregate that apparently loose activistic framework of such dramas from the overall sense of its inherent dramatic exploitation, that what our eyes are fundamentally being drawn to is the spectacle of children as soldiers, but not really how or why these children are being used as soldiers, or why these militias and massacres are taking place, or what the history leading up to any one militia or massacre even is. Beast of No Nation is definitely better on this than Johnny Mad Dog, because it at least gets into, in the latter part of the film, the very complicated process of what happens when the war is over, at least nominally, what happens when the dust settles and the militia disbands, and the very traumatic and complicated process of, for lack of a better term, deprogramming children who have been indoctrinated as child soldiers. It shows more interest in the aftermath and the lingering questions than just with the spectacle of it all. And even then, I think the thing that is so unique about Our Father the Devil is that it is a film that never explicitly depicts any massacres, any militias, any wars, but deals entirely with characters who have experienced those things and are now dealing not just with their own lifelong trauma, but just the essential reverberations of how these were these awful, vile things that they either witnessed, were victim to, or in some cases were made or became complicit in. But then at the end of the day, where they are now in life is a testament to the terrifying impermanence of it all, even the darkest chapters of their life, and how little apparent difference it makes on the world around them. In the Q&A conducted by Nikyatu Jusu, Ellie Foumbi mentioned that she first began working on this idea for a movie about former child soldiers around 2015, which I don't think it's any coincidence that that's also the year Beasts of No Nation was released. But there was also a film that got a very limited release in 2015, and I think eventually came out to Netflix. It was called Out of My Hand, which was directed by Takeshi Fukunaga. That is narratively, it's very different from Our Father the Devil, but structurally it's very similar in that it doesn't telegraph to its audience that it is ultimately about the echoes, the reverberations, the legacies of wars and ethnic conflicts and child militias in Africa. So I'm wondering if there might not have been a tiny bit of inspiration there. At any rate, it doesn't really matter. My main point is that Our Father the Devil really isn't a movie about what has become, unfortunately, the mediated foreign spectacle of the child soldier, of ethnic conflict, of violence and death in the jungle in Africa. It really is a movie that deals with the profound irony that occurs when the Civil War is long over, and what persists in its wake is what we might poetically borrow from the author Chinua Achebe and call a civil peace, where despite the fact that the official global story is that the war is over, the conflict has ceased, the violence has stopped, very often the witnesses to this violence, the victims of it, even the perpetrators of it, go back to this very macabre scenario in which their experience of things doesn't become much of a part of the narrative of how the so-called peace is achieved or how justice is served in that case. There's obviously a very allegorical quality to the story of what Sajo's main character and Sisavene's opposite to her are going through. Because whether or not Sisavene's character is in fact the one who is responsible for the appalling trauma that Sojo's heroine is experiencing, we could easily imagine in the context far away from this particular scene in the civil peace of Guinea or West Africa or Nigeria that there could be two people like this. One of whom is the primary victim of the other's violence, the other who, as the dust has settled, as the NGOs have done their patchwork job, as the international community has come together to broker the civil peace, the person who dealt this violence more or less gets to either go back to their normal life or start a new one. The film could very easily take place in a country in the west part of Africa. It could very easily be about Sajo playing a refugee who is rehabilitated by some missionary group or some NGO and gets a chance at a new life, only to discover that in the very same village or town or city she now finds herself, the warlord who killed her own family has been rehabilitated the exact same way. It could also take place in America, which is something that Foumbi originally said was how she attempted at first to conceive of the story before she realized that it needed a much more remote and evocative location than just anywhere in America. And that's the thing, I think seizing upon Lushan as the broader setting of this drama is so brilliant because while we never ever see Africa being portrayed in the film, it's fascinating, even Sisavene's character only ever refers to it as the jungle in this metonymic way at one point, because we never see any explicit depictions, not just of the violence of the past, but also the place that it happened. I ended up being struck by the ironic connotations of setting this story in a place that is not a jungle, so to speak, but is certainly a very genteel, very isolated, and very natural setting, a counterpoint to precisely that image of the jungle. So instead of the alluded to, the savage jungle that becomes Guinea in our Western imagination, we here have this drama set in the counterpoint of the idyllic, beautiful countryside, the countryside of southwestern France. That comes to stand in for all the opposite connotations in terms of the natural constitution, not just of the setting, but of the country itself in which the story is taking place. In the back of our minds, the jungle, so to speak, is always succeeding upon, always consuming Guinea. It becomes a permanent, not only endemic, but enveloping vision of what we think of when we think of Africa and the violence that is supposedly definitive of it. But then we get to the countryside, which is always just a part of France and speaks to the best, most natural and peaceful and cultured qualities of this country that previously, of course, quite violently colonized the jungle, colonized Guinea. I found that to be a very evocative, poetic, creative choice that I think Foumbi plays with very well and quite subtly. Nobody in the story ever comes out and has like a moment of some kind of oratory. Nobody gets a very convenient and self-satisfying speech where they say, well, don't you know, the violence we went through is an echo of what the colonizer visited upon us. All of that is just nestled so uncomfortably underneath the surface of the drama. This idea that in some ways, Our Father the Devil is really a kind of anecdotal, allegorical tale, not of some foreign violence and the trauma it inflicted, but of, so to speak, chickens coming home to roost. Of a violence that we have come to associate with the jungle coming back to the very quiet, superficially quaint countryside that first began that sequence of violence and trauma. But of course, that's not just part of the satirical irony of the story, it's also a part of its dramatic irony. Just like the violence of the jungle of Africa, just like how it is constantly occurring and being settled in this way that is almost totally atomized from the perspectives of the Western world, of the global North, of the so-called first world. Just as that stuff is always occurring over there, somewhere in the jungle, this tragedy is literally playing out right there in the quiet of Lushan, and it's completely atomized physically and emotionally from everything else. And I think there was this very definitive turning point in my experience of the movie, especially in the very particular setting I watched it in, where I got this very distinct feeling of the general audience with me slowly coming to suspect that all of these layers of irony and satire were perhaps pointing in a direction that, again, tonally, Our Father the Devil was supposed to be playing on a lot of different levels. Despite the fact that the movie is not very explicit, there are, of course, some scenes, especially the ones in which we really start to get into the biography of Sajo's heroine, that are really hard to sit with. They are about things that we find it impossible to consider in the light that is anything but the most maudlin and the most serious. And yet, I feel like there was definitely a point where we as an audience started to realize collectively that there were parts of the movie in which Foumbi seemed to be playing for ironic or dark humor. It wasn't immediate. It was one of those brilliant things where the first shoe dropped, Marie makes a really radical first decision that sets the whole plot in motion, and there was an element of it that was quite funny. But only one person seemed to laugh at it. Everyone else was sort of stuck in this thing where we're like, is it okay to laugh? Is this intentional? Is this part of what the director is going for? And I think over time, people started letting their guards down. There was more laughter in the audience at certain things, and I think we started to have a collective realization that this was part of the brilliance of what Foumbi was actually doing. As what is effectively a revenge story, it would be really easy to compare Our Father the Devil to something like a Tarantino movie, or at least put it in as part of the sort of post-Tarantino legacy of stylized, borderline genre movies and thrillers that play with the line between really quite harrowing violence, but also sort of absurd, self-aware humor. But the difference, I think, is that Foumbi isn't at all interested in aestheticizing violence, or at least she didn't have the time or the budget to do so, but watching how she cuts away in certain scenes and the way she moves her camera around, it's hard to believe that if she could show something, that she would. So you're caught in this very awkward position where the movie is constantly alluding to things that, the more layers you peel away from them, are really quite vile and awful to contemplate, and are made even more so because we don't have the distance of seeing them aestheticized for us. We have to imagine them, which means that they're open to everything awful that our imaginations can conjure. But then at the same time, Foumbi does provoke our sense of that ironic distance between what is going on between these characters and how alienated it is and how atomized it is from the bigger world around them, which in context really isn't that big, but still feels totally removed and anachronistic. Our Father the Devil is not the sort of movie that you expect to have a romantic subplot about the same heroine who is on this monomaniacal path of revenge, for instance. And while there are parts of that too that are very hard to watch, there are also parts that are just plain funny and play with that irony that those funny parts are occurring in one scene while just off center, allegorically and satirically, this awful violence and this cyclical trauma is being perpetrated. And that's the brilliance of that juxtaposition, because without ever being terribly explicit about anything, Foumbi proves really deft at disarming us at what often feels like the most awkward moment with something absurd, and then wrenching us right back to something that is, above all, no laughing matter at all. So I guess the most obvious comparison wouldn't even be to Tarantino, but rather something closer to like the latter European works of Paul Verhoeven even. Our Father the Devil becomes one of those movies that becomes just as much about the complex position we as spectators partake in watching a movie like this about this kind of subject matter. The satire embedded in it being that we expect a spectacle of trauma. We expect to be pandered to with an idea of how serious these subjects are and how serious we as good liberal consumers are for supporting and engaging with it. Not us though. We're not exploiting anything. We're not extracting the trauma. We're not failing to put something back in to actually heal this process. Because it's only for the reality to be that our obsession with this idea, this compartmentalization of child soldiers and ethnic conflict, of Africa in our minds, all of it being this boxed up set of spectacles and themes endemic to the jungle as one place. The reality becomes pointed up in the satire of the film that this is just as much a part of the perversion of our society, just as pornographic from an emotional perspective as our addiction to the depictions of heightened sexuality or violence. The point seems to be that if you as a spectator, especially in the Western world, in the world of the global North or the so-called first world, if you think you're going to learn something from the trauma of others, you could at least stand to be made actually uncomfortable, to have your own pretenses subverted with really gallows humor where you don't know if you should laugh. You don't know if you're allowed to laugh. But at the end of the day, the point is precisely that the film puts you in that impossible position. It really is quite a remarkable film, and I'm glad that the folks from the Biennale and Gotham and Netflix, I'm really glad they decided to open this celebration with this one, because it shows they really intend to put their money where their mouth is and really promote small pictures like this. The sort of small picture that ends up on the nomination card for Best Feature at the Independent Spirit Awards, and everyone says, Our Father the Devil, what's that? When did that come out? But yeah, again, don't slouch on the online Atlanta Film Festival screening. I'm definitely putting the Eventive link in the description to this video. But yeah, Our Father the Devil, definitely one to keep an eye out for when Cinedigm does decide to give it some kind of limited release, most likely. With that, I hope more of you do check out the film and let me know your takes, your opinions. I look forward to more people finding out about this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit that bell. This is Ian Garcia and Devotional Criticism, signing off. Until next time.